the skill set you need once you launch the game is no longer the skill set that brought you there. First, you need to launch a successful game, but then you need to start caring about what's happening outside of the game, and coding is not going to cut it.
Welcome to episode 14 of the Craft Podcast. I can't believe we made it to episode 14. We are joined today by Ilja Rotelli, who is head of business development international for Amazon Games. Welcome, Ilja.
Thank you, John. Thank you for having me.
So I've known you for a long time now, and I've actually listened to you. You've been around gaming and esports so long that you essentially have content out there. I've listened to your GDC talk. I've recently just re-listened to the community podcast you did, and I thought of some similar questions and some new topics to cover with you today. So the first question for you is, this podcast is about craft. What do you consider your craft to be? And since you have a lot of experience, you can have multiple crafts. Is it community management, or is it something else?
The vocabulary of community management has always been complex and unsatisfactory. The best way I can put it is ecosystem management. And I can explain what that means. I work in games. I work for Wizards of the Coast. I work for Blizzard. I work for Riot, now for Amazon Games. And the core of my job has always been to worry about what happens to the player outside of the game. This is very typical of games as a service. A game as a service is a game in which, instead of launching a game and moving on to whatever your next game is, as a game developer, you want to build a long-term relationship with a player base, and the relationship is predicated on creating content, getting paid for that content, so that you can create more content. And that's the simplest definition of what a game as a service could be, right? So when that happens, you're trying to build an evergreen, you're trying to build a game that lasts the test of time. Magic at this point, Magic was born in 1993, so it's going to become 30 soon. Dungeons and Dragons has already passed 30, and so forth. League of Legends, World of Warcraft, all of these are classic evergreen games. And they all share a number of traits, one of which is that as a developer, you care about what happens to your player outside of the game, which means that the skill set you need once you launch the game is no longer the skill set that brought you there. First, you need to launch a successful game, but then you need to start caring about what's happening outside of the game, and coding is not going to cut it, right? Like, you can't just code an experience outside of the game. And that's where ecosystem management comes into play. That's where community and esports and the disciplines that I've worked on for almost 30 years at this point help with a problem that is way broader than just delivering an entertainment experience. And I'll stop that for a second, but ecosystem management is the core of what I've been working on for 30 years at this point.
I think that makes sense in so many ways. First, I really like something you said on your last podcast. You said you don't like the concept of players as audience. And I agree with you. And frankly, many companies even do it today, and they will continue to do that. And I think with that analogy, I finally understood why in the past you were thinking about, if the word community management was really just a word you needed to use in the gaming company, because calling it ecosystem, it would like break their brains, right? No one, like, community, okay, but esports, okay, but ecosystem, that's a whole different thing. Which is interesting because, you organized esports under community, but I now understand the way you treated community was more ecosystem.
That's 100% correct. There's a number of aspects to ecosystem management. And one of them, a core aspect, is the relationship between people that play games and people that make those games. And so a lot of the thinking about community management, when you evoke the expression community manager, what comes to mind immediately is those humans whose job it is to facilitate a relationship between the people that make the games and the people that play the games. the reality is that history has proven over and over and over again that a community manager ends up being an ecosystem manager and does a number of other things that have nothing to do with managing the direct relationship between players and developers. And so ecosystem management is to some extent a leftover opportunity that the people that are in the trenches end up picking up. That's what makes the space incredibly immature, right? Like the fact that there's not enough recognition that building a game as a service and building a long-term relationship with the players requires a broad skill set to support players in a number of circumstances that are not just the relationship with the developer. And therefore, the disciplines don't emerge and don't mature, so to speak.
That's a good point. And I think, everything you're saying makes perfect sense, especially to people who work in the game industry, to people who are part of the gaming community. I think two examples, I like to use other examples outside the gaming industry just to really highlight how important this could be. So one example is something you shared with me a long time ago. It was like a Harley Davidson, Harvard Business Review article, and that was like from 2004. And I have another example just from recently, which is a lot of VCs have noticed that community is very important. I don't know if you've noticed this trend, but they're hiring heads of community for VC firms. And there's a growing movement where people are building a community first with their content and then building a product. So it's kind of fascinating to see, the venture capital world gravitate towards it. But can you talk more about this Harley Davidson example? Because I think once you told that story to me, that's what made me really, wow, like this isn't like a new thing. It's, there are really many good examples of this happening in the past.
There was one article from Harvard Business Review, I believe it was in 2009, it came out by Professor Susan Fournier, that for me was transformational. It was like that article, if you can read only one thing, you care about community and you can read only one thing, that's the article you need to read. And it was a case study on Harley Davidson, on how historical motorcycle company in North America almost went the way of the dodo, almost went bankrupt, and instead came back from the ashes and managed to assert itself as the iconic brand that we know today. Basically, what happened was that in the 80s, Asian competition was really hard to deal with for Harley Davidson. The motorcycles that came from Asia were high quality and lower priced than what Harley Davidson was able to produce. And so at some point, the ownership and the leadership of the company basically went away, and a group came together to try to save the brand and save Harley Davidson. What they did was they looked at, okay, we still have some customers, right? There's still people that, in spite of the superior products that are coming from Asia, are buying Harley Davidson motorcycles. Why? Who are these people? And what can we do that can resonate with more people like these? And they realized that for this small niche, Harley Davidson represented something that Asian motorcycles could not substitute. They shared a lifestyle and a type of set of values that they attached to Harley Davidson, and therefore they were not willing to buy superior motorcycles and give up those values. These people were gathering together. They were, during the week, they had no regular jobs, but then during the weekend they would dress in particular clothes and gather in events that made them a community of motorcyclists that loved Harley Davidson as a brand. And Harley Davidson, what they did is, these are people, this is the audience that we need to be relevant to. Let's support them. And they did that through a number of tools. Number one, they started organizing these events, and they were not just paying an event company to organize these events. They physically went as an organization to run these events themselves, merge with the audience that they were trying to serve, and eventually start hiring people from that community. So they started merging their DNA with the customers they wanted to serve, and the people that Harley Davidson was relevant for, all of a sudden, in a voice on what the next motorcycle should be, on what the design should be, on what the features should be for these vehicles should be. By being relevant to, by being customer obsessed, by merging with the audience they serve, Harley Davidson thrived and is now the iconic brand that we know. It's unclear today whether they can compete with Asian motorcycles or not, but that doesn't matter anymore because Harley Davidson transcends the simple functional value that you get from a vehicle that takes you from point A to point B. It's a set of values that defines an identity of a group of people, and as such is they built a gigantic competitive moat with competition. That's a classic that brand community, the concept of brand community is exactly what then applied to brands like Wizards of the Coast, to Riot, to Blizzard, and so forth. These are not people that play games. These are gamers. And the shift from an activity to an identity is crucial, and it's defined not by the game itself, but by the connection to other people that share values and a lifestyle that defines you as a human. That's super powerful, and it's something that it's really hard to compete against. And so, and the companies that understood the power of brand community and fostered communities and built systems to connect people with each other into their games have reaped the rewards of never-ending loyalty and evergreen games. And so that's the core concept of what building a brand community is about. And it applies to anything that creates a community. It's hard to build a brand community around soap, right? Like people that buy soap will not connect intimately, and they will not define themselves as a soap buyer or a soap user. It's really hard to create an identity around soap, but you can create an identity around motorcycle, and you definitely can create an identity around games.
So Harley Davidson created essentially, as you called it, an ecosystem around their business. And, we're focused on video games and esports here. So I want to dig into, let's say, the craft of that. So even understanding that, most companies don't call it ecosystem management, what are some of the typical roles you see in this, if this were like a team, for example, like social media manager, community manager, et cetera, like what would be like the universe of roles in the perfectly funded ecosystem team?
Absolutely. So normally there's 6 sub-disciplines of community. There can be more. There's a couple more that you can tackle on. But the 6 fundamental disciplines of community are player relations, player behavior, programs, editorial, events, and esports, right? Those are this is the toolkit you need in order to manage an ecosystem. Player relations is the classic role, this classic discipline that people think of when they think about community manager. That's the part of community that really manages the relationship between people that play games and people that make them. Player behavior worries about the relationship between players. So this is no longer the relationship between the developer and the player, it's the relationship between the players themselves. And in many games, that relationship tends to be toxic, right? Like if you have ever played a game of League of Legends, your own team often will attack you for underperforming. And that's your own team, let alone it can be intimidating for a player to step in a game like League without, and then being berated for their inadequacy, for your inadequacy. It's really hard. So there's an entire discipline that worries about how can we improve that relationship? How can we mitigate the toxicity and improve the connections and the team play across the experience so that people will want to stay in this game. The third one is programs. Programs emerges from the understanding that some players will step up and they will choose to play a role that is above and beyond just being players. Streamers, tournament organizers, magic judges, guild leaders, cosplayers, pundits on YouTube. There is a number of critical roles that are really expanding the experience for all players. If you're a League of Legends, Magic, World of Warcraft player, you are exposed to this part of the community disproportionately more than the average players. And as such, they really impact the perception you have of the company, of the game, and of the experiences that are being generated for you. So once you understand that, a programs team worries about identifying the people that are doing this, playing this role, and rewarding for it, right? If you organize tournaments in colleges, I need you to do more and continue to do a lot of that because you're building engagement for my game. What systems have I built? How do I know you? Have I identified you? Am I putting you on top of, am I turning you into a hero as you should be? Am I rewarding you for the work that you do? The fourth one is editorial. That's, again, very known role. It's what a lot of companies will refer to as social media manager. It's a lot more than that, more often than not. It also, the same group tends to also manage the game blog, manage collaborations with the community in which you create content that truly represents both the brand and the community that creates it. There's a lot of creativity and a lot of great content that can be generated through the editorial team. Then there's events. Events is fairly obvious, but it can transcend the physical event and it can be online events as well. And then the last one is esports or competitive play. Those are the teams that worry about developing a competitive scene for games that have the critical mass and have the potential for being games where somebody wins and somebody loses, right? And those are the basic disciplines. There's a few more, like development relations, for example, is a seventh one if you want to tackle one on, which is about, okay, so there's people that are building tools for your game, and they need an API, they need a set of rules to play by, and so forth. So you build it. There's a couple more sub-disciplines, but the core should give you a broad overview of what ecosystem management is all about.
And so you mentioned competitive play, and I think that's like a specific word. That word is not esports. What is the relation or the difference between, in your mind, esports versus competitive play?
The world seems to have defined esports as the part of competitive play that other people are willing or interested to watch. Without that component, it's not called esports, right? So for example, a Friday Night Magic event in our local hobby store here is not going to be called esports, even if it is played on Magic Arena. So the electronic component would be covered. It's not going to be called esports because nobody is watching that event. So the actual ecosystem you're trying to build is a competitive ecosystem that has a component that is watchable and interesting because some of the best players in the world are playing in that component. That's the top of the pyramid, right? But another interesting aspect of the gaming industry is that for some reason, right, all these lessons were already created by Wizards of the Coast in the 90s. Wizards of the Coast was the first company that used competitive play as a global system to support the promotion and development of the game. Magic tournaments, like if one were to look today at the number of Magic tournaments pre-COVID that Wizards of the Coast runs every year, we're talking in the ballpark of a million tournaments, right? Every year, which is insane to think about as a scope of work. All of that was created, developed, and refined in the 90s and in the early 2000s by Wizards of the Coast. And the gaming industry still has not caught up. The focus and the obsession is on the top of the pyramid and on the part that is watchable. And the rest is basically ignored under the premise that ranked play is good enough to take care of the billions of people that are playing competitively every day, which is, to me, not the case, right? Like you could be building a complete pyramid, you could be building the different tiers of competition, you could be creating achievable goals for the masses that currently ranked definitely doesn't supply, and that the rest of the system as managed doesn't doesn't supply.
That, that's amazing. I feel like the world needs to know about this. And I know we talked about this in the past as well. This would be a good either almost like, I don't want to say like manual, but you could also have you could theoretically have like a ecosystem manual which covers esports community, etc. Or this could be also like a history of esports, but with some practical applications. I think here's what I'm gonna do, because I've been thinking about this for too many years. I've now decided to do either or both, one crazy physical event per year and one content project. So like 2019 pre-COVID, it was like a triathlon. But then next year it was the documentary. This year is podcast / YouTube channel. Eventually we're gonna have to get into the book. So maybe next year is the year I start to talk to you about the book again. I got 3 pages so far, like an outline, and it's actually just based on notes I talked with you in the past. So I feel like I'm gonna run out of projects to do, like content type. So we might have to cross off the book off of our checklist next year. So that should be exciting.
Anytime. There's definitely a lot of stories to tell.
Another thing I want to get into is Wizards of the Coast, because especially the people who I interact with, a lot of people who work in the gaming industry, in their mind, it's really like Blizzard Riot. They don't like, even when you told me this whole story about Wizards of the Coast, I was like, oh, okay, this, like, you've educated me on something. So can you just give a quick history on like how Magic works and how the competitive play grow it, maybe even involving some of your own experiences when you were playing in Italy?
Yeah, I grew up as a kid in Italy in the 90s, and Magic came out, right? Like I was the nerdy kid that was playing old role-play games, and then got exposed early in 1990, probably 1993, maybe early 1994, to the first batch of Magic cards that made it to Italy. And a competitive scene organically grew by itself, basically, and then with the help of the local distributor. So I started traveling around the country and play Magic, and by 1996, I closed the season #1 in the rankings. I went to 5 pro tours that I was invited to by Wizards. I always sucked, so I was doing really well in Italy, but I've never performed at the professional level. So eventually I joined Wizards of the Coast. But that experience by itself was transformative for me as a person, defined my identity, my career, and what I was going to be forever, pretty much. But the same way was the seed of the brilliance of the system that Wizards of the Coast had created back in the days. Imagine that you're with a group of kids and you're playing games, and then one of you gets invited and flies to Chicago, and you're an Italian kid, and goes to Chicago and then comes back with stories to tell about this adventure they went into. Like, maybe you've never been to the United States, and you come back. Everybody wants to play Magic. Everybody at that point I want to go. I want for that to happen to me. So there was this driving force from the grassroots all the way to the professional level that for a second became real, right? Like, because you had one of your friends that it actually happened to, and that's a normal human that it happened to. And so that system that was created originally by Wizards managed to put together all the tiers of competition, from the pre-release tournaments, which are a brilliant idea to present a new set, to Friday Night Magic, which is your weekly play that you go to your local game store and play with your friends, and it becomes your group of friends that it's like a poker night, or like it's the same phenomenon. The game becomes an excuse to see your friends and to hang out, right? But then there's an opportunity for the ones that can perform to level up and to go to the next level, and that's the brilliance of the engine that Wizards of the Coast created. Over the years, the number of tournaments grew, and the number of tournament organizers grew, and Magic became that evergreen that could have disappeared in the 90s and instead became a centerpiece of gaming, an icon of of how to build a global community, right? Yeah, that's the core of, because there's a lot more to Magic. Obviously, I could speak for hours just on that, but that's the core engine that was built.
I think what's interesting is, obviously gaming and esports are industries, and then we talked about some of the disciplines where you could like that could be your craft within these industries. One thing that has changed my own mind as I've gotten more experience and older is that I really recognize like craft. So when I was younger, it just seems exciting to jump companies every 2 years. Okay, I'll do product and then I'll do something else and I'll do something else. But when you start, especially adding on investments, thinking about your life or your craft like an index fund, I feel like people don't pay attention, but all of a sudden you've got decades of really valuable experience, and which is why I think you're in the position you're in today. I do think we live in this world where you need to specialize before you become a general manager to some degree. So for our audience, as well as some of our craft podcast producers on this call here today, some of them are like Jimmy's 18. I think Josh is like 21, one in college, one just graduated college. What are the craft they could invest in, for years to get them, like a good position in the broad? I mean, gaming is just so broad now, but is it going to be tournament organizing, like be an expert in that, or is it going to be content production, like learn how to make the best thumbnails and reduce the frequency, in the YouTube videos? Like, what do you think, or what would you advise?
I'm not the right person to advise because I've always followed my passion, and found that that's so it was never a matter of clinical oh, these are the opportunities, I should go this direction because there's a bigger market for this direction or this one. I was a player, I knew how to play games, and then I knew how to organize tournaments, and that's what I ended up doing, right? And so I'm not sure I'm the best person to recommend a course of action other than consider very clearly what you're passionate about, because the beauty of gaming is such a big industry these days that there's room for everything. Like you could pursue legitimately the stuff that you are in love with and potentially make a good career, and there's going to be in it. But of all things, community is not a good, like of all the things you could be doing in gaming, to be completely honest, like think about it, there's no vice president of community anywhere, right? Like realize this, like community is such one of the biggest functions that exist in all these games as service companies, and not one that I know of as a vice president of community. There's a vice president of everything. There's a vice president of finance. There's a vice president of HR. There's a vice president of production. There's a vice president of design. There's a vice president, name it. Name a discipline, there's going to be a vice president for that discipline, except one, community. So clearly it's such a vaguely defined space and immature space, yet still, that I can't, with my conscience, recommend somebody, unless you love it, unless that's what you want to do, in which case, go nuts. Maybe you're going to be the first vice president of community. But other than that, like, pick something that is more recognizable, more defined, more mature as a discipline than the ones that I just described.
I think you are spot on, because it's not only like picking industries, it's like picking disciplines. So let me give you an example of another craft podcast guest that So Steven Size. So I feel like Steven, he made the right choices, but he also got lucky because he picked performance marketing and mobile games. So like two essentially mega trends. Absolutely. And if you ride that wave, you're just gonna go into good places. All companies need more user acquisition, and mobile games is just a highly profitable business. So there's lots of companies popping up. But if I would have to give some advice, I think my one regret is when I was younger, I was into coding, very light coding. We're talking about HTML5, which is really, HTML, which is really like scripting than coding. I feel like there could have been a path for me to continue it, but I just never did for whatever reason. And when I look at what's happening today and like How are people getting rewarded? You could definitely pick a discipline and just like build a career out of it, right? It could be marketing, it could be computer science, could be whatever. But the cool thing about computer science, but not everyone loves it, but the cool thing, if you could just do it, or you just have a capability of it, is that now you can theoretically even make your own games, which is amazing. And there's just so many platforms out there like Unreal, even like building on Roblox. There's just huge audiences, or learning Unreal and or Unity and using for like entertainment purposes to make like a TV series or like an animated TV show. So there's so many cool and like hard skills these days, that I feel like, given the right personality and interest level, these are at least going to be high paying jobs. Whether you want to optimize for high paying or not is, up to the individual, of course. Okay, so let's talk about another interesting story I know this from community, because as you said, there's no VP of community. And another great tweet that I saw a couple years ago, it was from the community manager of Fall Guys. So Fall Guys mega hit. The community manager got a lot of credit, and another community manager from another game basically threw shade at him and like subtweeted him and said something along the lines of, "Oh, this community management only comes into play once the game is successful." And then this guy had a great tweet, and he said, "Of course, the age-old, if the game is successful, it's like the game team. If the game is not successful, you blame community or like marketing." So yeah, it's like it's a really tough role. Even when you do it right, you've got other people who think you did nothing to contribute to it. So using Fall Guys as an example, because even to me, it came out of nowhere. So do you think, in that case, was there some community work before the game launched, and did they just like ride the wave? Like things were planned. It wasn't just like, okay, the game's successful, so therefore automatically we have a big social media presence now. I don't think it was accidental.
I think the management of Oliver and the management of the social media channels for Mediatonic have been exceptional. I use them as a bar in my internal training of how to do community engagement. All those social media channels that are used for ads or for PR, like for kind of robotically regurgitated messaging, are just wasted content. Players want to be entertained, players want to be engaged with, want to be heard, and that's the focus of how you use social media. Never put an ad, never like rare call to action when you really have to, and when it's a piece of content, ideally. And I think the guys at Mediatonic have done an amazing job, and all the awards and recognition that they got for that are all very well deserved. Whether a social media approach can save a bad game, I don't think so, right? Like the game needs to have a certain amount of quality in order to create a core audience, however small it might be. And then you can nurture, support, and listen to that core audience that you have, and use your channels to do that. And then in time, emerge a game. Like Among Us took years to become the global phenomenon it was. And at no point in time, the development team abandoned the audience they had because they were just too small, right? So it is possible for a game that has a spark of genius in it, that has the quality in it, that just needs to be discovered and developed and found over time. It is possible to do community management that will take you there. But it needs to be something to the game. Like if the game is bad, you're never gonna fix a bad game just with good community management, right?
This makes me think of something. It's a comment that you don't have to comment on, which is when I've been following the New World social media recently, and I think they're doing a great job. And I think it was really part of the seeds you planted many years ago, because the dev team took a while to start understanding that social media isn't like a broadcast channel, right? I mean, it could be if you approach it that way. But when I look at all the New World tweets right now, I love it because it's all full of engagement. It's timely. And of course, the hardest thing for a gaming social media manager is like the memes. Like New World has been pretty good with the memes. They're finding like people making funny tweets. Like I found one the other day where I think it was a streamer or a big fan. He said, after playing New World for like 30 or 300 hours, when he goes out in the world, he sees like the New World the UI placements for like tree or shrub. It's like dog, tree, shrub, and it's just so subtle. But that's the thing with memes, right? Like it's just image plus words, and it's just freaking hilarious. So it's great to see something from many years ago, and then like it evolves and it kind of struggles, and then ultimately hopefully succeeds. It's been successful so far in closed beta. Hopefully it does even more gangbuster from here.
I think you see the love there, right? Like if the people that are managing the social media channels, like Mediatonic, like the New World team, truly feel the players and they come from that community, they are one and the same with that community, then the language and the dialogue and the engagement come natural. It's just what they do and who they are that defines the content they create and share. And that's all. That's the best thing you can ask from a social media team.
Awesome. Well, thanks again for joining this podcast. How can other listeners get in touch with you? Like LinkedIn or Twitter? What do you prefer?
Anything works. My Twitter is @neutralground, and you can find me with first and last name on LinkedIn.
Okay. Well, thanks again for joining us today, and look forward to catching up with you soon.